Hi, I'm Ryan Schultz from The Ohio State University. In this lecture, I'll provide an overview of some of the connections between the development of medicine in China, Japan, and Korea, and the popular philosophies and religions of those countries. My focus will be on the pre-modern era, as that's when these connections were first developed and when they were at their strongest. We will begin by looking first to ancient China. Its medical tradition is not only one of the longest lived in all of history, but is also perhaps the most thoroughly documented in terms of surviving sources. The influence of Chinese culture on both Japanese and Korean medicine and religion was considerable, and so by beginning with China we will also be establishing a strong foundation for understanding the history of the other two. The origins of Chinese medicine are bound up with the ancient philosophical doctrines of Confucianism and Daoism. Both shared a common adherence to the ideas of yang and yin, two fundamental forces of the universe devised by Chinese thinkers as early as 600 BC, but not systematized until the work of the philosopher Zhou Yan around the 2nd century BC. In this system, yang was understood as dry, masculine, and bright. Yin, by contrast, was moist, feminine, and dark. These two forces, when in different balances, could cause diseases by influencing the qi, or vital force, of the human body. The diseases so caused were themselves classified into 6 different categories, based on the nature of the imbalance. According to the Zhouchuan, dated to the 4th century BC, an excess of yin qi causes cold illness, while an excess of yang qi causes hot illness. Too much wind causes afflictions of the extremities. Too much rain, afflictions of the belly. An excess of twilight leads to illnesses of confusion, and an excess of the brightness of day causes illnesses of the heart and mind. This same kind of interpretation also appears in the Huangdi Neijing, traditionally dated to the 1st century BC and considered one of the core texts of the Chinese medical tradition. Related to yin-yang was 5-element theory, another development that emerged out of the naturalist school of Zhou Yan. In this system, everything in the universe, including the body of man, is governed by the 5 natural elements: wood, fire, earth, water, and metal. Each element has a season and a set of organs associated with it. Water, for example, is associated with winter, the kidneys, and the bladder. Some connections, like this one between water and kidneys, seem to make intuitive sense even to us today, but others, like the relation of metal to the large intestine, require a deeper conceptual understanding to justify within the system of Chinese medicine. Though all this taken together perhaps sounds rather mystical to us today, these categories and ideas represented early attempts to categorize and make sense of what were then truly biological unknowns. Indeed, throughout early Chinese medicine, we can observe the application of a consistently rational approach, one focused on applying symbolic conceptualizations in a systematic way in order to understand the body and so categorize its ailments. This kind of worldview is consistent with early Confucian rational practices, which sought to provide names and explanations for phenomena in the world without excessive recourse to supernatural explanations. And this kind of approach was especially valuable because once diseases were named and classified, they could be treated and medicated in a consistent manner. The oldest form of medicine in this tradition, appearing in the original character for the term itself in Chinese, was liquor. And indeed, an imperial edict issued by the Emperor Wang Man, who reigned from 9 to 23 AD, mentioned that liquor was viewed as the most significant medicine of all. Herbal medicine also emerged as a systematized discipline by the time of the Han Dynasty, beginning before Wang Man, starting in 206 BC and lasting until 220 AD. A wide variety of herbs and poultices were being used by Han times, and strict compounding rules had already been devised in order to ensure synergy between the yin-yang and elemental natures of each ingredient. Plant materials such as ginger and ginseng were the most common ingredients in such tinctures, but minerals and animal parts, including oyster shells, deer antlers, and bear gallbladders, were also being used. Other early Chinese healing practices included massage, acupuncture, and moxibustion. Acupuncture is the application of needles, herbs, or pressure at points on the body at particular locations where vital force is believed to be transported to the surface, and the practice of acupuncture is today well known even outside of East Asia. Moxibustion is a similar procedure, except rather than using needles, burning moxa floss or other combustible matter is applied to the body at those same key points. These practices were steadily compiled into texts, and by the end of the Han Dynasty, a system of medicine had been firmly established in China, one based on both ancient classics and more recent reinterpretations of those ideas. From the 3rd century on, a period of steady standardization began, in which the classics of medicine were organized into a strict orthodoxy that persisted until around the 8th century. This creation of orthodoxy reflected, in part, a sense of longing in Chinese society at the time for a return to the forms of the highly Confucian Han Dynasty, which had given way to internal division and foreign invasion after its fall in 220. As Confucianism waned in social and political importance with the Han decline, Taoist religious practices began to make a greater impact on Chinese medicine. Early Confucianists, who believed themselves and their philosophy to be supremely rational, tended to dismiss Taoist medicine as witchcraft or sorcery. They believed its practitioners were too likely to be carried away in the pursuit of immortality. But Taoism was nevertheless a major area of medical innovation in ancient China, and as time went on, its ideas steadily came to be integrated with Confucianism itself as well. Key works in the Chinese medical tradition, such as the Remedies and Recipes of the Golden Box, the Alpha and the Omega, and the Treatise on the Pulse, all show considerable Taoist influence in their content. Indeed, understanding and curing disease were both important focuses of early Taoist accounts and writings. Within early Taoism especially, the presence of disease was thought to indicate some moral failing, meaning that physical health and spiritual health were often one and the same. In this, Taoism inherited much from the local shamanistic cults that it sought to replace as it spread across China. And in these cults, disease and disaster were both tied to the world of spirits and ghosts. While older religious traditions, perceived by Taoists as primitive, sought to appease these ghosts in order to cure the ailments they caused, Taoist priests instead laid blame for sickness directly upon the spirits themselves and sought to drive them away through their own therapeutic practice. Such Taoist practice often invoked the ordered bureaucracy of their own conceptualization of heaven and the world of the dead. For example, a Taoist priestly handbook offers the following procedure. For pains in the chest with rising qi and coughing, invoke the Lord Great Pivot of the Northern Quarter with his 120 subordinate civil and military officers. He has charge of the mansion of the Great Balance and controls the demons of coughing and rising qi, vomiting blue, yellow, red, and white, the 5 pestilences, virulent magical infection, and the 6 thirst specters. The offerings to be made are brooms, paper, and writing brushes. Other Taoist cures sought to expel ghost infestation from the sick body directly rather than through invoking the powers of the beyond. And this was often conducted with herbal medicine. The 4th century text, Prescriptions Within Arm's Reach for Use in Emergencies by Ko Hung, suggests that a demon infestation could cause chill and heat, pouring sweat, and pain throughout the body. At the time of the subject's death, the infestation would spread to another in their family. For treatment, Bark of mulberry root and small red beans were to be cooked and administered in a broth of mutton or venison. Another cure: 50 peach kernels to be crushed and decocted into 4 pints of liquid, then given to cause vomiting. This act of vomiting would expel the corpse demons in the form of worms from within the patient's gut. It's clear, then, from the above that in contrast to the more metaphysical approach of Confucian-inspired and informed practices, Taoist medicine tended toward conceptualizing disease as something caused not just by internal imbalances, but also by supernatural threats. This is much in keeping with the distinction between the two philosophies in this early age. Confucianism was concerned mainly with the secular world of politics and power, and thus appealed more to the literate elite, while Daoism embraced esoteric views of the world of ghosts, spirits, and gods, and sought to displace instead local shamanistic cults, rather than dominate the halls of power. The rise of the Tang dynasty in 618 was seen as a return to a golden age for China, after centuries of turmoil. But Confucianism and Taoism now had to vie for preeminence with a new foreign religion, Buddhism. While the Buddha himself had shown concern with the health of his monks and had expressed an interest in medicine, Buddhism as a doctrine did not develop its own original medical tradition at first. Instead, it tended to adhere to a generally secular view of medicine, derived from the Indian practice of Ayurveda, wherein health was determined by the balance of 3 fluids within the body: wind, gall, and mucus. Any discord in these yielded disease. But Chinese Buddhists instead tended to combine or even replace the medical precepts of Ayurveda with the pre-existing Chinese naturalistic traditions that we've just discussed. Still, Buddhism did bring its own unique causes for illness and suffering, and the most prominent of these was bad karma. Precisely which diseases were caused by the action of karma was a subject hotly debated amongst monks. But often those sicknesses that caused pain directly tended to be associated with karmic crimes. And since it was the mind that caused the speech and actions that yielded bad karma, it was also the mind that was often situated as the root of certain diseases in Buddhist conceptualization, even for diseases that affected the entire body more generally. Therefore, meditative trances and similar spiritual and mental practices, including healing visualizations, for example, were encouraged as cures to sickness. Other Buddhist practitioners identified evil spirits as the cause of illness, and so new spells and incantations were soon being introduced to serve a Chinese audience. Elaborate seals to be inscribed upon the body were designed to drive out demons and so free one from disease and ailment. Nagarjuna's Treatise on the 5 Sciences, a text dated to perhaps the 6th century, includes examples of numerous such seals. Some are to be applied to the body after the spot was rubbed with medicinal drugs, while others were to be drawn upon paper charms and then swallowed. Though such seal-making practices remained esoteric amongst Buddhists, and so were usually left out of state-sanctioned medical manuals, they continued to be practiced especially in rural areas where older and more magical medical treatments remained in common use. In general, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism continued to coexist and interact as religious traditions well after the Tang period had ended in China. But by this point, all three had well-established medical traditions that offered treatments to a wide variety of illnesses. And as time went on, the three began to resemble one another more and more closely, a phenomenon that was perhaps most visible in the hybrid theories of Neo-Confucianism that were being advanced during the Song and Ming dynasties. Though medicine in China continued to advance as new works in the Neo-Confucian tradition were published and new interpretations of old classics were put forward, there would not be a sea change in approach until the arrival of Western medicine and science around the 19th century. Let us now turn our attention to the connections between religion and medicine in Japan. We can identify two major sources of medical belief and practice in pre-modern Japan. First was Shinto, the native belief system of the island's people and its most ancient religion. The second was the Chinese medical tradition, introduced to Japan around the 6th century. It thus arrived already replete with the combined influences of Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist practice. Although the first surviving references to Shinto healing arts are found in the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, the main texts that established the Shinto founding myths of Japan, these two works were not compiled until the early 8th century, which was well after the introduction of Chinese medicine. As a result, it's quite difficult to disentangle the influences of these two separate traditions upon one another within Japanese medical history. Nevertheless, early documents that mention the Shinto medical tradition suggest that it was quite similar to the shamanistic practices found elsewhere in East Asia at the time. In this, the gods were seen as the determining factors in the curing of illnesses found in man or beast, and magical methods are thus as common as herbal ones. A 719 text, the Izumo Fudoki, contains descriptions of the use of ground seashell to heal burns, cattail pollen to accelerate recovery of wounds, and rice wine as an all-purpose curative. Other references to herbal medicine can be found in the Kojiki itself, and in cases where the plants under discussion are native to both China and Japan, their suggested curative properties often differ, which implies that Japan already had its own native herbology, one that predated contact with Chinese medicine. Generally speaking, though, the causes of illness in Shinto belief were tied up with the world of the gods. Evil spirits were a common source of sickness, and the cure was typically purification through the performance of certain rites. These rites could also be used to heal diseases incurred through contact with impure materials such as blood, corpses, or people with skin afflictions. Since such impurities were believed to be transmitted simply through contact or exposure, the Shinto medical tradition was therefore greatly concerned with the contagion and heritability of disease even in ancient times. However, Shinto priests themselves did not typically intervene directly in the healing of the sick, or in the burial of those who succumbed to disease or corruption, as the priests needed to maintain their own ritual purity. Though they might have offered charms or talismans, the process of purification was often left to the individual sufferer. Illness thus became synonymous with rejection from society, and the preservation of ritual purity was steadily elevated to a state duty, one to be observed through yearly Shinto rites conducted at the highest levels. As for Chinese medicine in Japan, it had arrived by as early as the 6th century AD, as we said. Qi Chang, a doctor from southern China, reportedly arrived around 561, bringing with him more than 100 books on medicine. Men like Qi Chang were welcomed by many of the Japanese elite, and indeed the rapid acceptance of Buddhism seems to have been driven in part by its therapeutic offerings. Many early Japanese writings that mention Buddhist monks in Japan reference their skill as doctors and protectors against disease. More willing than Shinto priests to involve themselves directly with patients, Buddhist practitioners of Chinese medicine seem to have found a ready clientele, especially given that they arrived just as Japan was being struck by a series of devastating epidemics in the Heian period of 794 to 1185. These epidemics prompted new attention to medicine and healing, and so Buddhist influence spread rapidly. For example, hot springs and baths, typically associated with Shinto purification practices, soon also came to be considered as places that were warded by the medicine Buddha. A booming trade in medicinal herbs also sprang up between Japan and the continent, and Japanese doctors readily imported plants that were not native to the Japanese archipelago. By the beginning of the Kamakura period in the 12th century, Chinese medical traditions had been internalized by the Japanese, and so they became subject to internal criticism and debate. Native reinterpretations and fusions with older Shinto beliefs continued to slowly alter Japanese medical practices well through the period of warrior rule and deep into the Tokugawa period. But the arrival of Western medicine soon heralded rapid change and led to a sharp transition away from Chinese medicine altogether with the Meiji Restoration of 1868. We move now to our final country of study. Of the three, the origins of Korean medicine and religious tradition are perhaps the least understood. The earliest Korean medical practices were likely tied up with local shamanism, and they were centered around local nature deities and spirits. But this period is truly shrouded in mystery. Indeed, given that the oldest extant Korean history dates only to the 12th century AD, we even have to speculate on when exactly Chinese medicine arrived in the peninsula. Most likely, this occurred when the Han dynasty of China established outposts, called commanderies, in the region around 108 BC. Though these commanderies did not seem to exert major political control over the peninsula, they did trade with its inhabitants, and some of the earliest Chinese pharmaceutical texts cite Korea as the origin for certain herbs and animal parts that were meant to be used in especially rare curative mixtures. By around the 4th century AD, we know that Buddhist monks were also beginning to enter Korea via China, and at this point the first Korean kingdoms had also emerged. Glimpses of the medicinal and religious practices of this time are all that we have, however. A 10th century Japanese work mentions receiving prescriptions from the Korean kingdom of Baekje during this period, and these prescriptions closely resemble Chinese practices. The Nihon Shoki itself suggests that the aforementioned Buddhist monk, Chi Chang, brought those Chinese books to Japan by way of the Korean state of Koguryo. But these dates and claims and events are hard to corroborate with what little other evidence we have. Fortunately, the victory of the kingdom of Shilla over the other peninsular states in the 7th century began to bring some clarity to the historical record, and it appears that by this time the Koreans certainly knew the basics of Chinese medicine, though it was coexisting with older shamanistic healing practices. By the Koryo period of 918 to 1392, we have things like surviving questions from an examination for a government medical post, which suggests that Chinese external medicine was now a focus of official study, including practices like acupuncture and moxibustion. Formal relations between Koryo Korea and Sung-era China also brought up-to-date medical texts to the peninsula through tributary exchange. In 1079, for example, the Sung emperor himself sent 100 prized curative items to Koryo's king when he learned that the king had fallen ill. By the 12th century, however, Korea had been cut off from China by the rise of non-Chinese dynasties in Northeast Asia. Korean doctors were thus forced to begin developing a native herbal reinterpretation of Chinese medicine, known as hyangyak, which replaced many Chinese herbs with Korean ones. A pharmacopoeia including these new recipes was published in 1226, for example. Buddhist religious medicine was also widely patronized by the state in this period, and that included the chanting of secret formulas as a cure to disease, and more ancient shamanistic practices also seem to have continued to receive recognition, especially among the common people. The successors to the Koryo regime, the Chosun dynasty of 1392 to 1910, moved away from Buddhism, and Chosun instead established Neo-Confucianism as the guiding philosophy of government and public life. With this came a renewed focus on Chinese medicine in its classical form, though it was now being reinterpreted and reworked to fit local conditions and pharmaceutical availability. For example, the Great Collection of Native Korean Prescriptions, an 85-volume work completed in 1433, identified 959 different diseases across 57 categories. It included an index to 703 different curative materials, as well as advice on where to find them and how to use them. Though it was compiled from some 160 different Chinese medical manuals, it often substituted native Korean ingredients for expensive or rare materials that were not readily available on the peninsula. It also included an extensive appendix known as the Prescriptions of the Taoist Immortals, offering some more magical approaches to medically difficult tasks like regrowing teeth, restoring hair, and increasing energy. As Chosun medical work continued, native interpretations of medical metaphysics began to emerge as well. The Danguibogam by Hugh, published in 1613, synthesized Hyangyak and Chinese techniques while simultaneously introducing a new and uniquely Korean approach known as constitutional medicine. But by 1884, Christian missionaries arriving in Korea had begun to introduce Western scientific medicine, and within a decade, the rapid changes brought about by Korean attempts at modernization in the face of threats from Japanese colonial ambitions and interference had both already begun to turn the tide against traditional Korean practices at the state level. Though older medicine survived the colonial period and the Second World War, today traditional Korean medicine coexists with Western scientific medicine, just as in China and Japan. In short, there is little doubt that medicine and religion were deeply intertwined in pre-modern China, Japan, and Korea. The various schools of Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism all offered their own unique contributions to the metaphysical interpretation of health, the compilation of cures, and the search for a true understanding of disease. And although Chinese medicine formed the basis of practice in all three countries, each culture also incorporated elements of its own native traditions into its medicine, and adapted both practices and pharmacy as needed to best suit local realities. The same remains true today, as each country maintains its own traditions, well after the scientific revolution in medicine swept through the world and fundamentally changed our understanding of the nature of healing. In this lecture, I've only just begun to scratch the surface of this topic, which is well studied in English. If you'd like to know more, please check out any of the sources that you can see on the slide above.